picture that I have picked here, Michelangelo's David, sculpted at the beginning of the 16th century. That's probably, if not the most famous statue in the world, certainly one of the most famous statues in the world, depicting the biblical character David when he was a shepherd boy holding a slingshot, as he's getting ready to slay the giant Goliath. So even though we are in a world with, say, ever decreasing biblical literacy, so it would have been a time in the Anglo-American world anyway, 200 years ago, let's say, or even 100 years ago, when people would have known Bible stories, a lot more Bible stories, and a lot more thoroughly than what they know today. But I'd suggest that the David and Goliath story, for example, still is pretty well known even so. In addition to that, Michelangelo's David, there are actually several other famous artwork of David, including Donatello's earlier statue David. This one is, as opposed to when he's about to slay Goliath with a sling, this is after he's already cut Goliath's head off with a sword. Anyway, in addition to being the inspiration for famous artwork, the story of David and Goliath, a young shepherd boy who kills a giant armored warrior using just his sling, that remains in common parlance in our language anyway as an archetype. So whenever the little guy is taking on a giant, metaphorically, say, so if you're fighting Big Pharma or something like that, that sort of story is referred to as a David and Goliath story. But even though David is known for this, and this is, like I say, still fairly famous, even with decreasing biblical literacy, David is known for more than that. So David is also known as the king of Jerusalem. So the biblical David went on, after being that shepherd boy to killing the giant slayer, he went on to become a king. And he's known anyway in the Bible as the first Israelite to establish Jerusalem as his capital. The Bible then subsequently judges all subsequent kings of Judah and Israel against David's example. So he's held up as the first, the model, not the first king, but the model for kingship in the Bible. As a result of David settling in Jerusalem, conquering it from the Jebusites, a Canaanite people, and making it his capital, the oldest part of the city, the area that is now just south of what has become the Temple Mount, that section of the city historically has been called the City of David, and indeed the whole city of Jerusalem is sort of called the City of David by extension. But that particular part of it, because that was the part that existed in David's time. The Bible also portrays David as king of both the southern highlands area of the Holy Land, the southern highlands area being Judah, the kingdom of Judah, and also the king of the middle and northern highlands area, the kingdom, the northern kingdom of Israel, in a kingdom that is essentially a kingdom that unites the 12 tribes of Israel. So he's king of Judah and Israel, a united kingdom according to the biblical narrative. In addition to that, the Bible sees him conquering his many neighbors and establishing an empire. And so that map, based not on archaeology or extra biblical history, but based on the Bible, often has made its way into atlases. And so this map, for example, was in the Hammond World Atlas that I had as a kid. It was from the 60s, but I was growing up in the 70s, and so that would be one of the maps that I pored over as a kid. You know, from the historical section, actually, in this case, the biblical section of a regular secular historical atlas at the time. There are other famous stories about David as once he's a king. For example, there is the story of David and Bathsheba. So Bathsheba is originally the wife of David's loyal soldier, Uriah the Hittite. While Uriah and David's troops are away fighting a war, David's enemies, David from his palace in Jerusalem looks out across to a neighboring house and sees Bathsheba bathing on a roof. He lusts after her and sends for her, has an affair with her, with or without her consent, it doesn't say. She becomes pregnant, and so then David is concerned that this affair is going to be discovered as a result of that, and so he sends for Uriah and has him come back. Wants him to take a leave so that he can also sleep with his own wife, and so therefore mask the fact that David has gotten her pregnant. But Uriah, being such a loyal soldier, while his cohorts, while the rest of the troops are in the field, he refuses to take that kind of a leave, and so therefore he sleeps at the king's door guarding the king's house as opposed to doing that. So David's plan is foiled. As a result of that, David writes a note. It's one of these wonderful literary things where you give the note, you want the person to be killed, right? And you like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, you put the note that you send as the messenger, and so he sends it with Uriah back to the front lines where the general is told, put Uriah in the very front of the fighting, and then once he is totally surrounded by the enemy, then pull back so that he'll be killed. And so that happens. It's an egregious abuse of authority on the part of the king. And so it's a pretty amazing story in the Bible. David is also famous as the author of Psalms. So in art, David is frequently pictured with a harp. He's known from the narrative as being a lyre player, a harpist. So if it was not enough for one biblical character to be known for, a number of poems in the book of Psalms are attributed to David, who is thus remembered as a poet-musician. So in the Middle Ages and medieval Europe, King David was thus a model for royal patronage of troubadours. So courtiers who played music and wrote poetry and things like that, this style that became invented in the Languedoc, the middle and southern France, in the courts of the Dukes of Aquitaine, Eleanor of Aquitaine's ancestors and herself, and her descendants, even like Richard the Lionhearted, her son. They patronized poets who wrote stories that were courtly stories that are meant to entertain, other knights and courtiers and things like that, and are telling things like essentially the invention of things like chivalry and courtly romance, courtly love, and so on. And so as a model of that, and indeed a model for kingship in generally, David was remembered anyway at that time as what the people in the Middle Ages called the Nine Worthies. These exemplars from the past who were models of chivalry, how a king or a chivalrous knight are supposed to behave. There's more. So another archetype that David is known for among gay men especially is, throughout time, so maybe it hasn't been as important to non-gay men, but anyway, the relationship between David and Jonathan being the son of King Saul, David's predecessor as king, has been a biblical precedent for same-sex love. So in the book of Samuel, we read, "The soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself." And that went both ways, because when Jonathan was later killed in battle alongside his father, David sings a famous lament, part of which goes, I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been a close friend to me. Your love for me was more wonderful than the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war have perished. And that continues to be a well-known phrase anyway, how the mighty have fallen. But you can see how that's, anyway, an archetype anyway for male friendship and love. For Christians, David is also kind of important as the ancestor of Jesus. And so because of biblical predictions, Old Testament or Hebrew Bible predictions, that a new anointed one, Messiah is the Hebrew word for that, and that's usually meant to refer to priests, but also especially kings, that a new anointed one, a new Messiah, would arise out of the fallen royal house of David. So the house of David, when the kingdom of Judah, when Jerusalem was destroyed, the princes of the house of David were taken into exile by the Babylonians into Babel, where they assimilated into Babylonian culture. And so one of the last princes that we hear of, or the last prince that we hear of the house of David, his name is Zerubbabel, which is a Babylonian word or name, which means, it means like son of Babylon or something like that. But anyway, something like that. But anyway, it's shows how fast they assimilated. He is allowed, when the Persians conquer the Babylonians, he and others are allowed to go back to Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and so forth. But soon thereafter, Zerubbabel falls out of the biblical narrative. So presumably, at some point or other, a Persian emperor decided it's too much to have a Davidic governor, because it gives maybe the Judahites, the Judeans, the Jews, too much thought that maybe they need to rebel and not be under Persian rule anymore. And so at some point or other, he was gotten rid of quietly, and thereafter Jerusalem is ruled as a Persian province under Persian officials, Jewish Persian officials who hold the high priesthood, so under priests as opposed to Davidic kings, and the house of David is lost. Nevertheless, because Christians saw that Jesus needed to be a descendant of David, both the authors of the Gospel of Matthew and Luke each independently created genealogies where they connect Jesus, by his parents and all the way back to David. And these genealogies are contradictory to each other and also have no historical basis. They're the creations of those authors. So, and another thing here anyway about David. David is possibly the first historically attested character in the Bible. So David may be the first biblical character whose historicity is attested by a non-biblical source. So we have an inscription on what's called the Tel Dan Stele, just to say the rock that's from the hill or Tel of Dan, which is where the city of Dan would have been at the very northern limits or frontier of the northern kingdom of Israel, Samaria, at the center place of where there had been the tribe of Dan's northern outpost. There's an inscription in Aramaic, the language of the Aramaeans, and the later adopted as the Hebrew or the Judean language in the Second Temple period. But in Aramaic, by the king of Aram, Damascus. So Aram or Damascus, it's around Damascus. This was another important local kingdom at the time. So in addition to Judah and Israel, there were the other surrounding kingdoms, Ammon, Moab, Edom, and then Aram, Damascus is one of the big important ones. And so at a certain point, the king of Aram, between 870 and 750, made this inscription, which refers to something called the Beit Daud. Those letters are there, which is usually, like Beit or Beth is like house in Aramaic here, and Daud or whatever it looks like David. So it's usually interpreted as a house of David. And so it does seem to be a reference, or it's often anyway considered by a lot of scholars anyway, to be a reference to David by somebody who's not, which is anyway, by not the Bible, by another source. All right, so that brings us then, like I say, to the question today. Who was David, both biblically and also, though, historically? So one of the questions we want to ask with this presentation tonight is, does the Bible begin to transition from mythic to historic with the stories of David? To evaluate this claim or theory, we're going to survey both the biblical narratives about David. We'll also look at the texts, the Psalms that are attributed to David, and we're also going to look at what archaeology and then also all of the contemporary extra-biblical historical evidence tells us about Israel and Judah in David's era, and that should get us to our answers. So we'll start here with the book of Psalms and David, since these are theoretically potentially written by David. So the book of Psalms is a compilation of hymns or sacred songs, psalms, which are individually composed over several centuries. So some of these are late, and they're composed in what we call the post-exilic period. So after that period of time that I just mentioned, where the Babylonians have taken the nobles and the Davidic kings and so forth into exile in Babylon, and the Persians have let them come back. And so in other words, the post-exilic period, 5th century BCE or later. But many of them were written before the destruction of the kingdom of Judah, in other words, prior to its destruction by the Babylonians in 587 BCE. So this is a period of time, especially in the century in the lead up to that destruction, when lots and lots of literary outpouring is happening, and a bunch of the Psalms come from that time period, and they do seem to be focused on Davidic kingship, they're focused on Jerusalem, they're focused on the Jerusalem temple, they're focused on maybe ritual things that are said in the court of the kings in Jerusalem and so forth, and in the temple. So 73, or about half of the Psalms, are attributed, not quite half, to David. So this attribution happens in the headings. Water here real quick. So the headings say, like on this one here, Psalm 23, a Psalm of David. That also, though, could be translated not only a Psalm of David, it could also be translated from the Hebrew a Psalm to or for David. So it could be one just even composed for David or to David even. So in any event, whatever it exactly means, all of these headings, it turns out, are actually late additions to the text. And so they are not original with whoever, if David was writing them, he writes a Psalm of David or something like that. That doesn't exist. Rather, they're probably representing at best the tradition or guesswork of later editors who were operating, centuries after when David would have lived, and so without any kind of historical knowledge to confirm that kind of an attribution. And indeed, scholars today really reject Davidic authorship for any of the Psalms. There's no strong ways to connect any of these to an actual historical David. It's very natural, ultimately. Why does the Bible call these Psalms of David? Why have they been attributed to him? So it's very natural when you have anonymous ancient texts for them to attract famous attributors. So because Solomon, for example, is famous for his wisdom, there's a lot of wisdom literature, including the books of Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes, the much later apocryphal book, The Wisdom of Solomon. All of those books are attributed to Solomon and even claim very carefully, I mean, very directly, not just in an added title or anything like that. They claimed in some cases to be written by him, even though none of those books is written by Solomon. Likewise, it's only natural, since the biblical narrative talks about David playing a harp and being a singer, psalmist, and so forth, that later editors would attribute Psalms to David, even though those are not written by him. So we get past then books that are attributed to David. We also now want to look at the source for the biblical narrative about David. So the narrative for David forms the central component of what we sometimes call the Deuteronomistic histories. So these are the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. So it's all kind of one school. It's usually thought of as being a school of thought, a school of writing, books that have a similar theme and theology, and they also seem to be attached to the same kind of thinking as the books of Deuteronomy, which is one of the 5 books of the Torah or Pentateuch, and also the book of the prophet Jeremiah. So Jeremiah is a prophetic writer who is living at the very end of the independence of the kingdom of Judah at the time of King Josiah, and later, and ultimately after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. Jeremiah goes into exile in Egypt, and he continues to be active for a while in the exile period and so forth. So Jeremiah and this overall school of that history is maybe coming out of, or it may be edited more afterwards, but anyway, is maybe coming from that kind of late time period in terms of the last blossoming of the independence of Judah as a kingdom before the destruction of Jerusalem. One thing about this theology and this school of thought is has a very specific narrative goal. And so the Deuteronomist is interested in promoting Yahweh-only worship. So you are not to worship any other gods but the God of Israel, Yahweh, Jehovah, and also in centralizing that worship so that that worship can be conducted in only one place legitimately, which is the temple site in Jerusalem. And on top of that, by casting this all in history and back into history, the Deuteronomist has a theological belief in terms of as a solution to the problem of evil, that suffering is happening when people disobey that. So in other words, God has covenanted with Israel, and if you do that and don't start worshiping after other gods, the gods of the Moabites and the Philistines and Asherah and all of the other pagan gods, then God is going to maintain you in the land forever. But if you do succumb to that kind of temptation, that's when you're going to get punished. And so the texts of those books very deliberately are cast to kind of show that. And it's able to work a lot better in the very early and mythic stories of judges and things like that, where everything is on a mythic scale of a generation of 40 years, and you can have that Deuteronomistic cycle where the people prosper in the land, they forget Yahweh, they start worshiping other gods. As a result of that, God sends the Philistines to come and punish them and chastise them. After they've been oppressed by the Philistines, they remember God, they pray to God. God sends a judge like Samson or somebody like that to cast off the Philistines. The people remember God and so forth. That's the narrative perspective of the Deuteronomistic history. Okay, so Joshua and Judges, Joshua picks up where Deuteronomy ends, so the end of the Pentateuch, the end of the Torah, with the death of Moses at the end of the Exodus story. And as his chosen successor, Joshua, leads the Israelites into the land of Canaan as conquerors. The book of Judges then goes on to describe the tribes of Israel living in the land of Canaan among the Canaanites and the other neighbors, but operating without kings. In other words, led by tribal judges in that sequence that I was talking about. So people like Gideon or Samson. The middle part of this, Samuel is a transitional figure, the very last judge, also a great prophet, who also anoints Israel's first king, Saul. So in other words, he's the end of the judges and the beginning of this period of kings. Saul initially prospers, but ultimately disobeys God. And so again, in the Deuteronomistic cycle, when you disobey, then God strikes you down and punishes you or whatever. So God instructs Samuel, we're going to do a do-over. We're getting rid of Saul. We're going to replace him with David. David then kills Goliath. He becomes a mercenary leader while Saul is king. And he then becomes king, reigning only after Saul's death. And then finally, in the books of Kings, they record David's death and the reign of his son and successor, the famous King Solomon the Wise, who builds the temple in Jerusalem. And then after Solomon's death, the remainder of the text tells the story of the division of the united kingdom of Saul and David and Solomon. Its division into two very unequal parts: the kingdom of Israel, which is the much bigger, more prosperous kingdom composed of 10 northern tribes, which is ultimately destroyed by the Assyrians in 721 BCE. And then the lesser, smaller, poorer kingdom of Judah, one lone tribe, centered, though retaining the capital, if not the name Israel, according to this idea of a united Israel kingdom under David, retaining the capital Jerusalem, but more or less nothing else, and ultimately destroyed by Babylon, the Babylonians, in 587. Okay, so let's look at the biblical narrative about David. So before David, as I say, the tribes of Israel have been ruled by judges. This has not been very successful, actually, as the way it's described in the book of Judges. And all the tribes of Israel at this point simply demand from Samuel, the last judge, to end this thing. We don't want to have rules by judges anymore. You're an old man, Samuel, and by the way, your sons are not following in your footsteps. We can't have any more judges. Now, they say, appoint unto us a king to judge us like all the other nations. Everybody's got kings nowadays. We want a king too. And Samuel actually has a big caution against kings. And so he says, if you're going to have a king, the king is going to he's going to tax you, and he's going to steal all your sons to make them soldiers for his war. And he's going to steal all your daughters to make them his concubines and so forth. And so this is not going to be a great thing, but okay, if you want it, we'll go ahead. And so Samuel chooses Saul. Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin, so it's the tribe that's in between Judah and all the other northern tribes, whose qualifications, according to the Bible, are: one, he is the most handsome Israelite. There's nobody handsomer than Saul, according to the book of Samuel. And two, he is taller than anybody else. He's a whole head taller than anybody. So obviously when you have a king, you want them to be super tall. And I say that as a 6'4" guy. So, no. Anyway, but there's always been that as a characteristic in terms of, anyway, bias. So those are Saul's qualities. Initially, Saul proves to be a very successful king. Both he and his son Jonathan are victorious in battles against the Ammonites, the Philistines, the Amalekites, all of the enemies of Israel, the tribes of Israel. However, again, the theme of the Deuteronomistic history is you have to obey and do everything, and one of the things that you need to do is exterminate all of the neighbors and non-Israelites in the land. And in addition to that, you got to kill everybody and everything. You can't just keep You can't keep their daughters as concubines or their livestock and so forth, because if you marry women with these different customs, that's going to introduce paganism into Israelite religion, according to, again, the Deuteronomistic history. And so Saul fails to kill the king of the Amalekites, and also allows that guy to keep most of his, they keep most of his valuable livestock and so forth instead of killing it and destroying it. And so God tells Samuel, I regret that I made Saul king. You got to go rebuke him, and we're gonna pick somebody else now. So while Saul is still reigning as king, so even though God has withdrawn his favor from Saul, Saul's still the king though. Samuel nevertheless then seeks out a replacement, and he anoints David, who's the youngest son, a Judahite shepherd boy, son of Jesse. Again, his qualities are, he's said to be really handsome in appearance, although presumably not as tall as Saul, and has beautiful eyes, they say. So anyway, they're picking kings by male beauty contests in the story here. Without knowing what Samuel has done in terms of anointing this young man to supplant him, Saul, who is looking for someone to be a harper in his court, to play the harp, he has, since God has left him, God has been sending, quote, an evil spirit to him that has been causing him to be disturbed and so forth. But when somebody plays a harp around him, that soothes him. And so Saul invites David to join his court, both as a harp player and also as his armor bearer, so a court position for the young man. So while David is in that position, the Philistine army once again invades and challenges to the Israelites to a single combat between champions. And this is a really interesting kind of story, which almost seems to be where Homer's Iliad breaks in on the Bible. And it's almost, you have a crossover here where, like in a universe where suddenly Superman is meeting the X-Men or something like that. In other words, between DC and Marvel. In this kind of case, Goliath is almost, their champion Goliath of Gath is pretty much almost described as wearing, Greek armor in the form of a Hellenistic, or not Hellenistic, a Greek warrior. And he's almost got the same kind of boasting hubris of a Homeric hero and so forth. So anyway, that's what they want to do. They want to have a single combat between the two armies, between the Philistine champion, Goliath of Gath, and anybody on the Israelite side who will do it. But nobody on the Israel side is prepared to fight a giant, since this guy is huge and so forth. And so ultimately only David, this kid, accepts the challenge despite his youth and size. Saul is like, how is this going to work out? He gives David his armor, but David's like, I've never trained with this, I don't know how to use this, and so he leaves the armor and the big sword, and instead he picks stones from the brook, and with his sling that he uses to defend his sheep from wolves as a shepherd boy, he uses that sling in order to slay the giant. And obviously the point of the story is that it's only because of God's favor, right? So there's the reason why such an unequal match shows that God is on the side of the little guy in the case of David and Goliath story. So from this time, after David defeats Goliath, David and Saul's son Jonathan become soulmates, and they fight a lot of wars together, and David's reputation as a warrior grows. In the course of this next period, David also marries one of Saul's daughters, Michal, and so therefore he's entering, more closely associated with the royal family. Now becomes the king's son-in-law, And meanwhile, though, because David is this now famous warrior and giant killer and so forth, a lot of popularity, and people are comparing him very favorably from David's perspective with Saul, unfavorably from Saul's perspective. So Saul becomes extremely jealous of David, and we keep hearing that an evil spirit from God rushes on him. So God is also intervening by sending evil spirits to Saul, and while that happens, he twice tries to kill David unsuccessfully. So he takes a spear while David's there playing harp and almost spears him and so forth. And so that David survives that, but in any event, things are not going well in terms of between David and his father-in-law. So fleeing now from Saul's court, the next phase of the biblical narrative, David becomes kind of the leader of a band of young mercenary warriors, David's young men, on a number of adventures. He's often aided by Jonathan. So while he successfully is evading Saul and doing all kinds of adventure stories and so forth, David twice has Saul in his power. So Saul doesn't know he's there, but he's looking for David, and David could kill him if he wanted to, but David declines to kill his father-in-law despite the fact that Saul is trying to kill him. and so it's showing the animosity is one-sided and that David is more noble and that kind of a thing. And so these are almost like the kind of stories that you have about a Robin Hood stories. So it's a band of these merry warriors who are not the king, but who are having to in this case flee, not from Prince John, but from King Saul and so forth. So the merry band of David's young men, that narrative continues when the Philistines, until when the Philistines kill Saul and most of Saul's sons, including Jonathan, at the end of the book of 1 Samuel. So David now becomes king of Judah, but Saul has another surviving son named Ishbosheth, who is initially anointed king of Israel, the larger northern kingdom, before Ishbosheth is betrayed and killed by his own servants. And so the book is sort of at pains to not make this civil war have been like David be a usurper, but rather the house of Saul self-destructs and David ends up being king because he'd already been anointed by Samuel and so forth as king. So David, now we enter a phase of David as king, and indeed a young, competent, successful king. So David conquers Jerusalem from one of the indigenous peoples, the Jebusites, that are there, and decides to make it his new capital. He transfers the Ark of the Covenant, which has been central to the Exodus story. This is the place where the tablets of the law that Moses has are kept, and it has also been sort of like it's not like a cart, but anyway, it's like a little wheelless cart that they carry around. This is, we were just in Seville where they're about to have these big celebrations where they're going to take all of the major statues from all the big churches, and everybody's got like a little sedan chair for them, and you get like 20 guys and you carry it around and so forth. And this is it's like a symbol and a totem of God being with you and so forth. And these were used, it was also used in battle. So you kind of have that as a sign that, God is marching into battle with you and so forth. So David is going to transfer that ark from a town in Israel called Baal Judah, and he plans to build a permanent temple for it, to house it in Jerusalem. God, however, indicates to him that the actual building of the temple is going to have to be left to David's son. Nevertheless, because of what a great guy all around David has proved to be, as in contrast to Saul, God decides to establish a covenant with him, the Davidic covenant. And I'm going to read it in a fairly long quote here, just so that we can get a sense of it, because this is really central to the entire idea of the Deuteronomic history, the Davidic covenant. So God says, I myself took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be the leader over my people, Israel. And I have been with you wherever you have gone and have eliminated all of your enemies from you. I will also make a great name for you, like the names of the great men who are on the earth. And I will establish a place for my people Israel and will plant them so that they may live in their own place and not be disturbed again, nor will malicious people oppress them anymore as previously, even from the day that I appointed judges over my people Israel. So God's like, okay, yeah, I get it. I mean, nobody liked the judges period. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord also declares to you that the Lord will make a house for you. And when your days are finished and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you, so Solomon, who will come from you, and he will establish his kingdom. And he shall build a house for my name, the temple. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be father to him, and he will be a son to me. And when he does wrong, I will discipline him with the rod of men and with strokes of sons of mankind. But my favor shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. So this is a unconditional, unlimited covenant that God establishes with David. That says his house, the house of David, is going to continue to be on the throne of Jerusalem forever, and there will not going to be, there's not going to be replaced or ended like happened with Saul. So David then, in the story, goes on to defeat all of Israel's enemy, conquer his neighbors, and so forth. So the tone of the story shifts once again, beginning with the egregious abuse of power in the story of Bathsheba, which I already recounted. From there, the narrative pulls pretty directly into courtly narratives. You'd think that Bathsheba story was maybe going to be the low point, but actually it goes down further from there. So 2 Samuel continues to focus on stories of courtly intrigue as an aging and increasingly weak King David falls prey to the politics of his many competing wives and their sons. And so this would have been a very common theme in a Middle Eastern court when you practice polygamy. So when there's practice of having multiple wives and sons, this is something that continued on, for example, even into the court of the Ottomans, where very famously, when the Ottoman Sultan and Caliph, when he, Emperor of Constantinople, when he dies, one son has to kind of emerge fairly quickly out of the harem and be the one that is going to be the successor, and he has to kill all of his brothers. Otherwise, any one of them that escapes can kill him, and so it is can be kind of a brutal succession thing. There's lots of, you don't only just have when you have monogamy and primogeniture and so forth, you maybe have an heir and a spare, as Prince Harry calls himself. But or in the Capetian sense, they almost always more or less only produced one son. They were really good at that, the French kings, and that helped France to build itself up from weakness in the Middle Ages to being a very powerful kingdom by the early modern period. In this case, you pretty much have to kill all your brothers in order to keep this kind of thing going, and that happens a lot in these stories of court intrigue in the books of Samuel and Kings. So David's son, Amnon, there's a story next, he lusts after his half-sister Tamar, and he connives, for example, to have his father, he says he plays sick and he wants his father David to send Tamar to him to give him medicine and so forth. And once she comes and is in his bedroom and so forth, he rapes her. So David is ultimately aware of Amnon's crime and he's angry about it, but he really does nothing about it. So he's ceasing to be a font of justice. So Amnon is, the son of David by one of the wives. Tamar is a daughter of David by a different wife, and by that same wife, she has a full brother, Absalom. And Absalom then, is had his sister dishonored by his half-brother. Their mutual half-brother decides that he's got to avenge her, and so he also, tricks his dad into sending Amnon off with him to a shearing festival, and when he's drunk, he kills Amnon, and so forth. And so while David grieves for Amnon, he doesn't punish Absalom. And so he lets Absalom flee, and then he later lets him return to court without really any consequences for the murder. So again, aging David is weak, and he is not a font of justice, and so the court is spiraling out of control. While this is happening then, Absalom kind of sets himself up as a rival king in Hebron. So Hebron had been the capital of Judah, according to the biblical account, before the capital moved to Jerusalem. And now he just kind of has his own court. He's acting like he's the king. And his popularity grows such that people, they can read the writing on the wall. They see that Absalom is going to be the king. So people's loyalty switch to him. And that actually ultimately forces David to flee his own capital, flee Jerusalem. Absalom takes the capital, and with the advice of his advisors who want him to complete the takeover, he actually sleeps with all of his father's concubines, causing that another level of dishonor, so that it's never going to, David can't be brought back, they can't be reconciled, and so forth. Civil war ensues, and yet David is still impotently, constantly telling his generals, deal gently with Absalom for my sake. Don't hurt this young man, this rebel who's trying to destroy him in all these different ways. And so it's only, when Absalom dies, when his hair is, this again, beautiful, more handsome and beautiful than any Israelites, and has long flowing hair, and it gets caught in the branches of an oak tree, and so then his servants kill him against David's orders, since David, even though he's fighting for his life and his kingdom and everything like that, in theory, is so, I don't know, he loves his son so much that he can't fight him. So despite all of the actions that Absalom has taken, then David just, very emotionally mourns his son, which, allows court intrigue to continue. So there's just more and more of these kind of courtly intrigue stories as David becomes too aged to lead troops against the Philistines and so forth. Ultimately, amidst the chaos, David's favorite wife, Bathsheba, of that same Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite story, is able to convince David, having made an alliance with one of the prophets, to name her son Solomon as David's heir, and then one of David's other sons, Adonijah, who has kind of already been kind of taking kingship again, just like Absalom had been doing. When David dies, Solomon successfully executes his half-brother, and actually others too, in order to secure the throne. So, like I say, it's a pretty sad end for David's reign, this kind of story of this valiant young shepherd boy who trusted God so much and was able to kill the Goliath, ends in this very weak, impotent way as his entire house is killing and raping each other and so forth. So this is a rich story, but also an embarrassing story. And so when modern historiography got going, when historians were first looking at the text like this, early historians sort of argued on the basis of criteria like the criterion of embarrassment, that it made the story of David's historicity kind of likely, because they asked themselves, why on earth would biblical authors tell such an embarrassing story if they were simply myth-making? If you were making a myth about your founder, why wouldn't you write a story that he's all perfect? And indeed, we can even have an example of that myth-making, because we have this story of David that I've just talked about from the Deuteronomistic History. So Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and Kings. But there's also 2 books of Chronicles that are written much later in the post-exile period, where a writer essentially is taking the Deuteronomistic history as their source, and they're continuously cleaning it up. So they're taking all the embarrassing stuff and just eliminating it, which is what a person would maybe want to do if you have embarrassing episodes in your history and so forth. And so Chronicles, kind of in my opinion, doesn't really have almost any historical benefit at all, except for to show how people would want to clean up the history if they could, and so forth. Anyway, nevertheless, even though this story is weird and people question why you would make it up if it weren't history, archaeology has now pretty clearly demonstrated that the idea of a united kingdom of Israel and Judah together under Saul and David and Solomon is a myth. So that never occurred. There never was one combined kingdom of Judah and Israel ruled from Jerusalem, the way the biblical narrative tells it. And so then that undermines the main component of the historicity, what the story is kind of trying to tell. And so let's look at that. So when people first started doing archaeology of the Holy Land, archaeology initially kind of grows out of tomb robbers and adventurers who who are reading the Iliad and wanting to dig up Troy and so forth and find artifacts and things like that. And so it only at a certain point does it actually get to its current level of sophistication and so forth. So working initially from the premise that the biblical accounts were largely historic, many, even all through the mid-20th century, archaeologists erroneously identified certain sites as Solomonic. And so they would go to cities like Megiddo and Hazor and Gezer, and they would say, well, Megiddo has got to be one of these major frontier cities, outposts of this powerful King Solomon's reign. And they go and they find a big tell that they excavate, and it has a big royal complex with stables, and it has a big type of gate and so forth. And because they have assumed that Solomon's kingdom is historic, they've gone to a place in the kingdom which they've found a building or a city complex, which they then identify as Solomonic. And then they say the fact that there's a Solomonic site here confirms that Solomon is actually historic. So that's circular reasoning, right? None of the sites have an inscription that mentions Solomon or anything like that. So it was only simply, how do we interpret what the site is? That's one of the issues always with archaeology as opposed to history. History, we have all this text, but we don't know if it happened or not, and we just know that people wrote about it, what people wrote, and we have to think of when they were writing it, and we have to read into their biases and so forth. With archaeology, you've got all this stuff, but it doesn't necessarily say who made it or what it was. So there's been a lot, though, more recent work from archaeologists like Israel Finkelstein, who have identified all of these previously thought of as being Solomonic sites, centers, as the work of the Omride dynasty, these kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, Samaria, Israel, that are not based in Jerusalem, not part of this mythic united kingdom, but rather the northern kingdom. One of the other clinchers for this is not only that all of those sites have architecture and everything else that mirrors the capital of the northern kingdom, Samaria, and so forth. The supposed capital of David's united kingdom, Jerusalem, remained a really tiny village that did not grow in importance until after the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel in 721 BCE. So in other words, this time period centuries earlier, when supposedly David and Solomon are ruling an entire empire, they're doing it from this crappy little village. It doesn't make any sense. You would have to, you would have a capital where you would bring in, all of the supplies that you'd need in an Iron Age kingdom, all of the chariot places for your chariot teams, your stables, all these kinds of things, as you would have to control produce and everything else. It doesn't exist for Jerusalem at the time period for David and Solomon to be ruling. By contrast, the Omride dynasty of the north built a very substantial new capital at Samaria, and those forms, like I say, mirror the construction previously thought to be Solomonic at Megiddo and so forth. It's not just the archaeology. There's lots of archaeological studies. To show again, the Northern Kingdom had earlier economic development. It was much more densely settled. There was really only a handful of villages that that Judah was even ruling. It was some less developed and so forth. But also then, there's all of the extra biblical historical record tells the same story. So the relative importance of the Northern Kingdom is really confirmed in everywhere of Israel's neighbors that we have records and stelas, inscriptions, and so forth. So, for example, the Assyrians like to write a lot of propaganda about all the different people that they conquer all the time, or they say they're going to conquer, or that they fought, and so forth. And so there's a 9th century BCE Assyrian stela that states that the Omride king Ahab of Israel, he defeated him in battle, is what they like to claim. But anyway, but what they do is they also say is that Ahab was part of a coalition of local, West Syrian leaders, including the king of Aram, Damascus, and so forth, a lot of these other little Iron Age kingdoms at the same time as Israel is around. And essentially the kingdom of Israel, Ahab, is actually providing the most chariots and troops and so forth as part of this anti-Assyrian military coalition. And likewise, other neighbors, like the kings of Moab, refer in their inscriptions and stelae to the house of Omri, referred to Israel and the Omrides, as opposed to referring to Judah and the house of David, or Israel as led by the house of David under David, or anything like that. That doesn't exist. So the house of Omri and the biblical narrative. So that is also, Omri is also a character in the Bible. The biblical narrative does acknowledge the house of Omri as rulers of the northern kingdom. And the northern kingdom in the narrative is called Israel. And the biblical narrative actually does acknowledge that the northern kingdom is really much larger than Judah, consisting of 10 tribes to Judah's 1 tribe. So the only thing that, it's a weird thing in the narrative from the mythic united kingdom of Israel under David and Solomon ruled from Jerusalem. The southern kingdom doesn't even get to keep the name. They just keep 1 tribe, Judah, and the capital, which is actually just a little village, and it is not big enough to be the capital. And the northern kingdom keeps the name, all the major centers and everything like that. It doesn't really make a lot of sense in terms of how the narrative works. So instead, though, in the narrative, Omri, his son Ahab, it's a fairly famous wicked king, Ahab's Sidonian or Phoenician wife, Jezebel. So Jezebel is an even more famous wicked queen. So you can just even think in their sons, Uzziah and Ahaziah, and Jehoram. So these are all viewed as just terrible villains through the Deuteronomistic perspective of the Bible, of this portion of the Bible. So again, why? Because they're viewed as being rebels against the rightful house of David, and also as setting up places of worship that are rivals to Jerusalem, and ultimately also of worshiping gods other than just Yahweh, the God of Israel. So the danger is if you, as the king of Israel, Ahab, and you were growing and expanding your influence and so forth, if you make an alliance with the Phoenicians, neighbors who are closely related actually to Israelites and everything like that, who speak a related language and have almost the same alphabet and all this kind of thing, and you intermarry, and then as a result of that, your wife Jezebel is going to bring her god Baal, to your new city of Samaria, right? And that's the danger, according to the Deuteronomistic perspective of promoting Yahweh-only worship. So that is therefore, from the biblical perspective, the Deuteronomistic perspective, that wickedness is ultimately the cause of Israel's fall. And because it's actually written from the perspective when Israel's already fallen, they're able to show that cause and effect retrospectively. So this is just another one of these Assyrian stelas that's really neat, where we have a guy, Jehu, one of the kings of the northern kingdom. Jehu of the land of the people of Omri, as the inscription says, bows before the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III. So Jehu was forced to pay tribute, according to this stela, in 841 BCE. And so a little over a century later, Assyria stopped just taking tribute and just conquers Israel altogether. And when they do that, as we talked about in our Lost 12 Tribes lecture a month or so ago, takes the kings and also a bunch of the nobles and relocates them, pulls them back to the Assyrian heartland and the area kind of northeastern Iraq and so forth. And as part of Assyrian policy, brings other people and moves them, Aramaeans and so forth, and moves them into Samaria. So here's kind of a map of how that goes once the Assyrians have not only conquered and absorbed Israel, which is now ruled directly, but has also defeated even Egypt and Judah and all the neighbors and so forth, and made them client kingdoms, which is to say kingdoms that are still independent to an extent, but they have to pay tribute to the Assyrian Empire. And so you can see at a certain point, Assyria is dominant and controls the entire Middle East as the first really great empire. And so the time period when Judah actually, as we see archaeologically, as we see also for Jerusalem, the time period when Judah actually rises is after Israel's fall. So although biblical maps tend to emphasize the independence of the kingdom of Judah pretty much from the destruction of Israel by Assyria, Judah becomes a client kingdom of Assyria, which means it's technically has some independence, but it has to pay a lot of tribute. At different times, it's in a state of rebellion where they're not paying the tribute, and the Assyrians are maybe trying to simply punish them and maybe destroy them and take them over and incorporate them as a province altogether, but it remains a client kingdom. As a client kingdom, though, it actually prospers a lot because Assyria has a very huge economic, let's say, trade zone, which is now connecting Judah to international trade and is also allowing, because it has got its own kind of independence, what had been Samaria and these other conquered provinces where there's a lot of heavy taxation and so on, a lot of people have fled in exile and relocated to Jerusalem, which now does develop as an urban center. So within the economic sphere of Assyria, Judah prospers in the 7th century BC. And now that's when we see Jerusalem actually develops as an urban center as the Davidic kings welcome exiles from the destroyed northern kingdom of Israel, Samaria. So it turns out that this building phase in Jerusalem also corresponds to literary output. That's often something that happens. So substantial construction in Jerusalem as a royal center corresponds with remarkable output of literature, including all these biblical source texts, like the sources in the Deuteronomistic History. So therefore, the Deuteronomistic history does not date to the era of David, but it instead is being written in the period after the fall of Israel, Samaria. And in fact, kind of late into that. So when the Davidic kings Hezekiah, Manasseh, and especially Josiah are reigning, in Josiah at the end of the 7th century BCE, and then even beyond in the last weaker kings as the kingdom is on a path to fall prey to conquest from Babylon. So this is time to maybe, I've talked about dates so much here, and I thought, well, let's bring in a timeline and try to work this out a little bit so we can see these times that we're talking about. And so I'm taking a timeline here from 1200 to 400 before the Common Era. We have, at the beginning of that period, that Bronze Age collapse. So this is this time when the earlier empires, the Mycenaeans, the Minoans, the Hittites, those kind of empires, the Mycenaeans and the Minoans and the Hittites, fall. The Egyptians have to fight off the sea peoples, and so Egypt continues to survive, but in weakened form. And this is also the moment when the Philistines come and invade Canaan and become established in the plain next to the hill country of Judah, and establish the Philistine sites. The Philistines may have originally been sea peoples. They may have originally, maybe they were originally Mycenaeans even. But by the time, and that's maybe why they have like Greek armor in the case of like Goliath or things like that, although maybe not. So it's by the time we get to the time period when the Bible is actually written, however, they've lost their language. So they have assimilated and they are speaking a local Canaanite language, which is just like Israelite and everything like that. So it's part of these kinds of language. Then we have, on here I have this grayed out area, which is when the, let's say, mythical united monarchy of Saul and David and Solomon would have been set. So this is early, between sort of the year 1010 BCE to maybe the 930s, so the 10th century BCE. So this doesn't correspond to actual historical reality. However, there is an actual event that happens at this point, which is kind of a revival of Egypt, where the pharaoh Shoshank I invades Canaan, and which is to say the area of Judah and Israel and Phoenicia and the Philistines and so forth. And so one of the things that happens when the Egyptians do that is they destroy the Canaanite city-states in the lower areas, which is one of the things that allows Israel and Judah in the highlands to develop, and specifically Israel. So the kingdom of Israel, Samaria. And so we have on here then Omri, who is the real kind of founder of that kingdom of Israel, as opposed to the mythic founders of David and Solomon and so forth. And that kingdom in its existence until it's destroyed by the Assyrians. Then we can see the ongoing kingdom of Judah, which now develops under Hezekiah and later Josiah, until we see there when the Babylonians, the Babylonian Empire is also encroaching. The Necho, the Pharaoh, kills Josiah. I have on there a listing then in Josiah's time, maybe as when Deuteronomy 1, the Deuteronomist 1, the first draft of the Deuteronomistic History is maybe composed. And then during the exile period, the Babylonian captivity, that's maybe when the second draft of the Deuteronomistic History is compiled. And then later in the Persian period with Ezra, that's maybe when the Bible, as we start to have it, is mostly, like the Torah and so forth, is mostly all composed and edited into its final form. So much later, obviously, than this time period when David and Solomon would have been around. And indeed, you can even see if the Deuteronomistic history is written at the time of Josiah, which is like essentially the earliest it could have been written. This is already so many centuries after when David and Solomon would have been around that there's really no, the memory really can't be preserved for that kind of a time. And that's why that history actually, as always with text, it refers especially, and the historians or the writers know about their own time. And anything that they have from the past, from before that, is garbled memory that is always viewed with an anachronistic lens of their own time. And specifically, the powerful lens that it is distorted through is this idea of Yahweh-only religion and a Davidic covenant, which they are seeing at the present for King Josiah and maybe Hezekiah, even as early as Hezekiah, but they push back into all of history way past into the past when it did not occur. So let's look at those kings a little closely, because this really is the period of time. This is maybe the earliest, and then Hezekiah's successors, when any of these texts of the Bible could have been being written. So Hezekiah is a king of Judah soon after the fall of Israel to Assyria, and he's the one then who's welcoming northern exiles to his growing court at Jerusalem. So he's forced to pay tribute as a client king of the Assyrians, but he also rebels and holds out against an Assyrian invasion. So all of the rest of the kingdom of Judah is kind of, destroyed by Assyrian forces, but he successfully weathers a siege, which shows that Judah is now on the rise if they can actually hold out against this vast empire and so forth. Hezekiah also, there's a turning point in the biblical narrative, and Hezekiah is remembered for really pushing monolatry, which is to say Yahweh-only worship, and specifically removing all of the idols to other and cult forms to other gods from the temple, which the Deuteronomistic history says Solomon put there, and also destroying rival worship centers, the various high places within the kingdom of Judah. And he does other things like, for example, destroying the staff of Moses. So this had been an important object which in the Torah Moses holds up in order to cure people and so forth. This had become the center of what apparently viewed as a pagan worship by Hezekiah. And all of those actions are celebrated by the Deuteronomists. This is what the Deuteronomistic history wants you to do. They want you to be like Hezekiah and destroy all of these pagan things, to worship only Yahweh and so forth. Nevertheless, Hezekiah's son Manasseh reversed almost all of these reforms. So between 697 and 643, his reign of 55 years, he rebuilt all of the high places. He restored the idols of Asherah and Baal to the temple. He restored the cult of the temple prostitutes and so forth to Jerusalem. He even revived the Canaanite practice of child sacrifice to Moloch. So this is all of these kind of things that the Deuteronomistic historian of the Bible does not like, and thus Manasseh is, terrible, terrible king. And yet, here's the problem. The way the Deuteronomistic history works is, what happens when you do all of those things, when you forget Yahweh, when you start worshiping all the other gods, when you restore the pagan temples and things like that? You're supposed to get smitten. But Manasseh ends up having an entire long, successful reign, a peaceful reign and so forth. And so this doesn't happen, and it's hard-pressed for the Deuteronomists to even explain why that should be. Because when they are writing the story and making a literary story, that's not how it works. So when you're telling, the story again in the book of Judges, written in the time long, long ago, when we're saying once upon a time, your story always ends with when you do these bad things, God smites you. In this case, when it's contemporary, when this is the time period when they are actually writing these things and living it out, it turns out when you do all those things, you don't get smit. And so it becomes a test of faith in that sense for the reformers. Nevertheless, when Manasseh's grandson Josiah, as a child, is put on the throne, his advisors are all the monolatrists, in other words, the Hezekiah kinds of reformers. They regain power. And so in Josiah's name, the court again destroys all the high places, all the rival centers of worship. They cleanse the temple again. They cast out all the different idols and temple prostitutes and so forth. And they even, under Josiah, go north. So the kingdom of Judah expands just a little bit and enters into the traditional territory that had been part of the kingdom of Israel, Samaria, the shrine at Bethel, the house of the Lord. This is the place where the northern hero and patriarch Israel, Jacob, met with God. And this is also the place where one of the places where the northern kings established a special shrine which was a center of worship at the house of the Lord, which was with one of those golden idol bulls, right? And so Josiah's troops attack that. They seize that place and destroy the shrine, and indeed burn human bones on the altar to totally desecrate it forever, to get rid of this rival shrine. You are only going to worship now at Jerusalem. And, kind of amazingly, interestingly, Josiah is the only king within the entire Deuteronomistic history which is predicted, way ahead of time. And so in the book itself, there's a prophet who 200 or 300 years earlier predicts that a king one day named Josiah is going to destroy the shrine at Bethel and burn human flesh on it and so forth, burn human bones on it and so forth, which is what he does, right? And so how is that prediction so accurate? It's because now we're seeing when the Deuteronomistic history is actually being written in the time of Josiah. We also have a description of how the scribe priest Hilkiah finds a book of the law, which is speculated by many scholars to be the book of Deuteronomy, or possibly the book of Deuteronomy plus the first draft of the Deuteronomistic history. And so they say, here, look, Josiah, look what we found. We found now a literary book that is justifying all of our program of Yahweh-only worship and so forth. So no king is as honored by the Deuteronomist other than David than Josiah, which is one of the arguments, is also used in favor of the argument that maybe this first draft of the Deuteronomistic history is composed during Josiah's reign. So Josiah is the only king that's favorably compared to David. He's a new David as far as the Deuteronomistic history is concerned. And his works are written into the text, like I say, as a direct fulfillment of prophecy, even so far as to predict his name. Nevertheless, he doesn't end up being a great king at all. Very unexpectedly and very anticlimactically, Josiah is killed by the Pharaoh of Egypt, Necho II, at Megiddo. So Pharaoh again has brought out his troops and so forth and has gone to the plains. Presumably he summoned all the local kings around. Josiah's gone up there and he just gets killed. And so the promise that the Deuteronomist holds for Josiah's reign goes completely unfulfilled. And indeed, soon after Josiah's death, Judah falls and the Davidic covenant itself is broken. God has promised that the house of David, the scepter shall never depart from the house of David. And ironically, for the Deuteronomist, since they wrote that covenant, this house that had potentially has been there since before their memory, so into prehistoric times, that house of David had been ruling Jerusalem, and now they've written this covenant back into its history, it ends up being broken almost immediately. So the Deuteronomist school. So let's look at their perspective a little. So Jeremiah, whose prophetic book is associated with the Deuteronomistic school, and is actually he's traditionally identified as the author of the books of Kings. Traditional attributions are not always any good, but it's interesting in this particular case. He's also said to be the son of Hilkiah, that priest who found the scroll. So he's got a lot of stuff associated with all of this, in addition to the fact that his themes and his book has all these literary overlaps with it. So it means then that all of these histories from the Bible, supposed histories from the Bible, are actually written in the context of the era of Hezekiah and especially Josiah's reforms. And so as a result of that, the Deuteronomistic school very anachronistically recasts all of Israel's history and Judah's history in the light of that very late reform of Yahweh-only worship, of Davidic rule and Jerusalem as the center and so forth. So why would they do that? Well, there are mutual advantages of this Davidic myth. So for the northern exiles from Israel, now that they have, let's say, moved to Judah and are part of this new court in Jerusalem, and they are now writing in this literary output, writing under the patronage of the Davidic kings of Jerusalem, it really makes sense for these guys, priests and other writers and so forth, to cast Israel and Judah as sister kingdoms, and even to say they were all once originally the same kingdom. And it makes even more sense to tell your patron Hezekiah or your patron Josiah that their ancestor, they're from the house of David. So you have an eponymous ancestor, David, that was an actual guy, and he was actually the real founder of Israel, not Omri. Omri was a sinner and so forth. And thus, Jerusalem has a claim to the entire inheritance. So the northern kingdom's already been destroyed anyway, but there's still lots of Israelites who live there under Assyrian direct rule, and many of them are still worshiping at Bethel and Shechem and Samaria and so forth. And the more we can change their focus to Jerusalem, the more we can actually expand maybe Jerusalem's borders into Bethel and so forth, so that eventually we can say you have a claim to all of that inheritance. And indeed, the house of David is the only legitimate heir to the entire inheritance. So this all leads us to probably what you're probably getting from the whole beginning of this, the non-historicity of the David stories. So likely then, what was known of David at the time that all of these biblical stories about David were composed is simply that the kings of Judah, the kings of Jerusalem, were from a house called the House of David. In the same way, as I've said, that the kings of France originally, the Franks originally were from the house of Merovingians. And so the Merovingian kings presumed they had an ancestor named Merovich, and they sometimes people wrote myths about that guy or so forth, and that's often true. So there's often a house name, and you assume then that house name is about an ancestor. So there's a presumed ancestor, but you don't know anything about him other than his name. So why are there embarrassing court narratives? So this is just coming out of writing entertaining stories for a court. And now that there is a sophisticated court in Jerusalem under King Josiah, embarrassing narratives like this are probably informed by all of the things that Manasseh did. So here's this king who reversed all of the reforms, and he brought had all these wives and concubines, brought back all of the paganism and so forth. That's just what David and Solomon did in their last years in their dotage and so forth, right? And so essentially people are writing stories about maybe what's going on at the time of Manasseh or recently at the time of Josiah about what had just going on, and rather than spending all the time criticizing that, and it's a little dangerous sometimes, putting that into the past as those ideas of those stories into the past in a safer time period with David and Solomon. And it's also possible then the other set of stories, David as a scrappy mercenary leader, Robin Hood style guy, that may be informed by actual memories of Judah's relative strength in relationship to the Old Kingdom of Israel. So these sophisticated northern exiles, they are aware that, we're the sophisticated ones. You are our southern bumpkin cousins, but the scrappy thing that you had going for you was kind of this Robin Hood style thing. And that maybe is like what David was doing earlier and that sort of a thing. So, that kind of brings us to, I just brought this back again, but just to kind of show you again where that is. So, kind of the earliest components of this biblical narrative being composed, possibly in Hezekiah, but more likely in this Josiah time period. There's a lot of scholars who would rather put the whole thing into the exile and actually the post-exile period. So this is among the earlier datings that are even possible because it reflects as always, the time period when it's composed, not the time centuries earlier when it supposedly set. People don't have the expertise to do that. The memory, it doesn't exist. You can write about what you know now. So what about, just as we end, what about the Goliath of Gath story? So even did David even slay Goliath? We actually have in 2 Samuel a completely second tradition about who slew Goliath. And so we'll just read that here. So now it came about after this that there was a war again with the Philistines at Gob. Then Sibbecai the Hushathite struck and killed Saph, who was among the descendants of the giant. And there was a war with the Philistines again at Gob. And Elhanan, the son of Jerah-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And there was a war with Gath again, where a man was of great stature, who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, and he was also been born to the giant. And when he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck and killed him. These 4 were born to the giant at Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. So there's a whole bunch of compacted stuff here in this about lots of giant killing and so forth. There's a tradition of that this Philistine city of Gath is producing giants or so forth. But here we have a different hero, Elhanan, a Bethlehemite guy, who is the person who kills Goliath, the giant. And so, once again, one of the things that happens if you have, if you're known for wisdom like Solomon and somebody writes a wisdom book, a lot of times it'll get attributed to Solomon. And same thing, if you're known to be a warrior, one of the things that happens is that lesser warriors get their stories glommed onto you, So that'll happen in mythology all the time when, a story about some lesser god will get attached to Apollo later, or it becomes an Apollo story, or it becomes a Zeus story, because those are more famous gods and they absorb the stories. And so there may be a tradition anyway. There's a tradition here in the Bible that somebody else actually even slew Goliath. And I know that this is fixed. Like I say, the Book of Chronicles fixes this by just saying Elhanan is another name for David. Well, again, Chronicles is all about fixing problems in the Bible, but it doesn't make it historically so. So that is my little summary of who was King David, and hopefully you found that interesting, but you may have also sparked some further questions, and we'll see if Leandro has been watching those for me. So Rain asks, how important was the continuation of actual bloodline to historic kingdoms of the Bible? Was adoption a real practice, or just after the fact justification of a coup d'etat? So there was always, there's lots and lots of coups in the biblical narrative even, and it does seem that was happening. So I emphasized with the Northern Kingdom, the Amrite dynasty, because they were the ones that sort of were the best known, and indeed The neighbors even thought of Israel. One of the names for Israel was the land of the people of Omri, and so forth. Nevertheless, the Deuteronomistic history of the Bible records a number of coups before the ending of the kingdom, before the kingdom falls to Assyria. And so a lot of cases, the chief general will take over and so forth. The problem that you always have as a usurper is that once you kill the king and you're the general or something like that and you take over, there's another general might kill you and take you over. You don't have that basis that people have who are the king's son or born in the purple, as they say. So I would say it's still important. Is adoption a real practice or just after the fact for a coup d'etat? So I think it is a practice. I don't know if we can say for sure, because again, a lot of this is not historic, but I mean, when we get to actual history, adoption, for example, was a practice during the really good governance that was happening in the Roman Empire. When we think of the best guys like Marcus Aurelius and Hadrian and everybody, those great emperors were adopting, let's say, the most qualified successor, and that was a way that they were actually bringing stability. But just as often it would get to a dynasty, and then I think it was even Marcus Aurelius who screwed that up by having his rotten son, succeed him. And so that is always a thing that can happen, because you always have some legitimacy if you're the son of the king or the emperor. Kenneth Gregory says, center place, when do scholars believe that the books of Samuel were composed in their current form, and have scholars been able to use textual criticism to estimate when the stories in the books originated? Is it possible the story of Saul and David's conflicts had its origins in the propaganda from the house of David just to justify his usurpation of Saul's throne? So it's all way later. So it's not even about usurping Saul's throne. It's by the house of David to justify their claims at the very end of their independent reign of Judah to a Jerusalem-centered worship and being the last people standing because of the destruction of the northern kingdom is when that will have happened. And so the current form, so we know that early forms are very late, because, like I say, there's even a prophecy in the Deuteronomistic history where they predict that there will be a king named Josiah who's going to do these things that Josiah actually did. And so it's not written before then, and then there's also, it also continues on until the whole end of the kingdom and the destruction of the kingdom and so forth. And so there's understood to be a draft that is made, a update at least in the exile period, and so and then many scholars are going to suggest that there's further editing and redacting that happens later, even than that. And so it wouldn't be to justify a usurpation of Saul, who's essentially a mythic character. Are the Deuteronomic books, Tristan Turner asks, are the Deuteronomic books polemics arguing from Yahweh's priests who didn't know these historic kings? Maybe Davidic kings practice a more polytheistic faith, and retroactively, these Deuteronomistic authors describe how kings should have been. Absolutely. So to the extent that David was a historic king, he is more like a tribal leader of a little hill town. In other words, the independent hill country chieftain of Hebron and Jerusalem and so forth. And he would have been a regular polytheist. So this would have been long before the Hezekiah and Josiah reforms, which is the beginnings of Yahweh-only worship. And so 2 centuries or so, this semi-mythic ancestor, when he was a historical person, would have been just a regular pagan, like Landor talks about in his lectures. Rain says, biblical authors tend to take their time when writing things down, usually hundreds or thousands of years after something happens. Can this logically be explained as oral tradition written later? So I don't think so in this case. And so the way oral tradition is going to work, if it's going to be passed down and really survive, is you need to have a thing like where you compose like oral poetry or something like that. So it's just one thing if you have like Homer, the Iliad, and you have an epic poet that is telling that, and so it's composed before they have writing, and some of it survives in maybe its original, although the poets are also modifying it and changing it as it's going through that. We don't have anything like that for this. So the things that, because this is not an oral tradition largely that is not being written down. There is poetry in the Bible, and so in some cases what's happened is there are plenty of earlier texts that the Deuteronomistic historians have embedded. They might be an ancient text or an early text that they have embedded into it. And so things like, this also happens in the Torah, so things like the Song of Moses, the Song of Miriam, or the Song of Deborah, these are like old things that predate the text, but they're not so much older. So even those are only a couple hundred. I mean, at the oldest, it can't be too much more older. So it doesn't anywhere get close to, let's say, the time period of Moses or anything like that. And so, so as a result, there is no historicity to books like Exodus and Genesis, which are written way after the fact. And so if there's any kind of I wouldn't even say there's probably even a remembered story that has any historicity to it at all, but in any event, it would be totally different from as written. Donnie Lee Gringo says, who were these writers of the Deuteronomistic history? So I suggested kind of at the end there that it's a school of priests that are aligned with the kings of Jerusalem and Judah, and are maybe also aligned with and included or part of the school around Jeremiah, who is a prophet who is active at that time. That's probably about as close as we can get to them and who they are. We can't say that for sure, but that's a theory that a number of scholars have. Michelangelo says, was the story of David's census based on any real census, or was its literary purpose? So yeah, this is one of the things that happens at the end of David's reign. It would not have been based on a real census anyway from David's time. It may be based on a census that is taking place, let's say, at the reign of Manasseh or something like that. And so again, it's all of these stories are probably based on events that are relatively, or the kinds of things that had been happening relatively recently in the Deuteronomistic writer's time. And so maybe, again, memories of things that happened under Manasseh or somebody else. And in general, the example of this, once again, is that this is another story that then gets cleaned up by the chronicler, right? And so God tells David to do a census. David does a census. God punishes David for doing a census. In the chroniclers, it's Satan that tells David to do the census. Nobody wants to have a census because having a census means you're going to have to pay taxes. So that's where that story comes. Marvin says, was there any evidence whatsoever that the two kingdoms were ever united even after the time of David and Solomon? So no. The evidence, so if they're united at all, there does seem to be distinct developments in both the lower hill country, Judah, and then the middle and upper hill country, Israel. And it does seem to be very distinct in all the different kinds of archaeological surveys. To the extent that they will have ever been unified, it would be because the northern kingdom had conquered the southern kingdom and and the southern kingdom was having to pay tribute to it. But it would have been the same way that the northern kingdom was conquering Moab or somebody like that. In other words, the kingdoms are totally uneven. There is a northern kingdom that is important. There is a southern kingdom that is not important. It's a hill chieftainship and so forth. And so we can't entirely say what was happening with that hill chieftainship because it's not important enough to get mentioned by the Assyrians and stuff like that until the Assyrians conquer Israel and make Judah a tribute state at that point, a tributary state. And that's the only time it's going to start getting mentioned. Owen Wall writes, do you believe the historicity of the northern kingdom being 11 tribes to make 12 total, or do you think that was made up later to fit with numerology or whatever? And Leon has a similar question. Do the 12 tribes that some people love to talk about really filter down through the two kingdoms narrative? So we've had a whole lecture already recently, like a month or so ago, on the 12 tribes. 12 is a magic number. There are not simply 12 tribes. There are more tribes than that that are part of the northern kingdom. There are more tribes, even part of the southern kingdom, than Judahites and so forth. Essentially, the answer is that at some point or other they wrote, they wanted to have 12, and at some point or other they made a list of what the 12 are, and some of the even more important tribes didn't make it on the list, and some of the unimportant tribes did make it on the list, and so forth. So it's a arbitrary convention, and indeed all of the 12 sons of Israel, those are all mythic figures that are eponymous ancestors of the actual tribal name. So they already had a tribal name, and then they make up a mythic character to represent it. It's like if we were to tell a story about Canada, coming and hanging out with and going to dinner with Illinois or something like that. In other words, as if Illinois is a person and so forth. We have to scroll up. Daryl Scott writes, did David's story acquire any new symbolism with Christianity? I would say so, yes. So David, David in the entire Old Testament for Christians ultimately is not, it's not really what's happening in terms of history and law and anything like that doesn't really matter. What matters is there's meaning for it, and the meaning is an antitype for Christ, which is the type, right? And so David, as a Messiah precursor, embodies Christ the same way for medieval people. Let's say that the animal of a lion symbolizes Christ, or the eagle symbolizes Christ, or all of those kind of things. And so all of the components of the David story, are overlaid with Christ and just messianic ideas and things like that within Christianity. Rain asks, what about branch Davidians? Was David Koresh a simple cult leader? How would you rate his claims to Davidic righteousness? I am not an expert on the branch Davidians. I mean, in terms of if you were saying that he was claiming to be a lineal descendant of David, the way, the Jesus's lineages, that we have in the New Testament are fictional. If David was a historic person, because he's a king, and we probably had a lot of children at some point or other, it's completely possible, the way genetics work is that pretty much everybody who has any kind of Middle Eastern background would be a descendant of David, in the same way that, even people as recently as Genghis Khan, because he had so many concubines and so forth, there's like a huge percentage of the population are descended from him, and at a certain point it also genetically, if we're worrying about that, it doesn't matter because it all washes out pretty quickly in terms of just a few generations. You have no real they always have in TV shows, like Star Trek, you have like a great grandson, and he looks exactly like, they use the same actor to play him as they do this with the actor who plays Data all the time. So he's the same, and he breathes true, but that doesn't actually happen. So David Koresh, I don't know what he was making in terms of claims of being a Davidic leader, but I probably wouldn't have bought into it so if I had met him. So Michelangelo says, what was the character of Joab written as a model of a good general, or why was he such a good and important and to me interesting character in this story? Yeah, so I think that is interesting. So I think that one of the things that is happening, in a story when you have a declining king, is that sometimes then you still have a loyal officer who, even when the king can't make good decisions anymore, is still more loyal to the king's best interests than the king is himself able to be. And so it's literarily just a wonderful character to have, and so forth. And ultimately, these kinds of stories of tragedy and betrayal and all of those things are literarily, there's great literature, and they still are the kinds of things that we can still, make HBO series about and things like that. And so that's why courtly intrigue stories are so much more interesting than if you were just writing, let's say, myths where everybody's perfect. Because if you just write a myth where everybody's perfect all the time and does everything perfect and they're always good and they always good things happen to them, that becomes a very boring story very fast. And so one of the reasons why these stories have had this staying power is because of their origin as courtly stories. So Leandro asks, did the Maccabeans or Herodians claim Davidic lineage? And I think that they don't. Which I think is crazy, because I think, why wouldn't you do that, right? But I think that maybe people just knew that they weren't, and again, I don't think that Jesus claimed Davidic lineage, the historical Jesus, ever claimed Davidic lineage. I think that Christians, long after Jesus was dead, claimed that about Jesus because of their understanding of Jesus as fulfillment of the Bible. So all the things they didn't know about Jesus, they believed that Jesus was fulfillment of Scripture, and so therefore, when they had a gap and they didn't know what Jesus had done or anything about Jesus, they assumed, based on their knowledge, that Jesus was a fulfillment of Scripture. They felt quite confident and able to fill in the gap with what they would have known from Scripture. Wednesday Jones asks, is there ever a divergence on the origin and etymology of names from the actual time of David and the time of Hezekiah when they had lost their language? So they were still having the same language during that time period. I mean, it's evolving. I mean, it would be changing, like you say. So the difference here would be, so names is interesting because one of the things that happens with the Yahweh only worship is that you have to start getting rid of names that have Bel in them, and so one of the names, I'm trying to think of what his name is, I can't remember it, but anyway, Gideon, who is one of the heroes, one of the judges, this general in the book of Judges, has a name that he goes by, which is something Baal. And so in other words, it shows that he is a Baal worshiper, as another name. And so they have to censor those kind of Baal names, from their history. And so they do change that. So I always like listing how, that place name that they brought the Ark of the Covenant from is called, what was it called? It was something like Baal Judah or something like that. And that town gets its name changed, and it's not called that later in the Bible. The chronicler changes that because they don't want to have a Baal name. And so they are having to censor their names, like you were saying, and change them in order to recast heroes from an earlier time before Yahweh only worship, as if Yahweh only worship had been the thing that had happened all the way back to the Garden of Eden, which is also an invention. Right? So Owen Wall says, why would the Deuteronomists have written about David as such a weak king in many ways if he's supposed to be the mythic founder of this kingdom? So I guess I would say that this is they're probably drawing from a bunch of courtly stories that are being generated within the court of Jerusalem. And so at a certain point, there are all kinds of legendary stories, and they don't actually necessarily even cohere with each other, but they brought them together. So on the one hand, he's the leader of a merry band of men and so forth, and a great warrior, and so on. And he also, but he also has all of these intrigues. And so maybe those stories are being told within the court as a kind of a criticism of what's happened under Hezekiah or Manasseh or something like that. And because those stories are known, those are drawn in by the Deuteronomistic editors who are bringing stories together. So Friedman, who is one of the last major proponents for the documentary hypothesis, he feels that that the Deuteronomistic history, he can identify through it a further continuance of the J source or the Yahweh source. If there is a Yahweh source, he thinks that it can be identified through the Deuteronomistic history. In other words, that it wasn't originally only in the Torah only, but actually is also a longer source that has been cut up and made into the Deuteronomistic stories. And so it's possible that they are working from a pre-existing source that includes these kind of things, and then they are recasting the whole thing in terms of their worldview of you have to focus on Jerusalem-centered worship, Yahweh-only worship, and so on. So there's an actual note here from, so if you can pull up, Landro. There's a note here from Finn Hager who says the Maccabees couldn't claim Davidic lineage for two reasons. One, they were priests, which made them from the tribe of Levi. Good point. And there was a recognized Davidic claimant, Simon ben Gamliel. So, okay, there we go. So in other words, there was a rival who was claiming Davidic kingship or Davidic lineage, and like you say, they were the wrong tribe. So that's a good point. Well, very good. Thank you for that. That's the end of our questions. I really appreciate you all joining us. We will continue our lectures now going forward again, now that the trip is over. And so next week we're going to talk about the Sayings Gospels of Thomas and Q. Thanks.